Resources and the current chair of the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council for another day until Andy takes over. So we're pleased to have everyone here today. Glad everyone could join us, and I think we have a bunch of great speakers lined up for today. Our theme is fire history. I'll go through a little overview stuff before we get started. We do have a great attendance at our conference this year. If you weren't on yesterday, we had some great presentations on COVID and other topics yesterday, prescribed fire. And today, our topic, like I said, is fire history. And we're able to reach kind of a wider audience than we normally do with burning issues. Normally, this is a face-to-face conference that we hold at the Fort Custer Training Center every year. And we usually get maybe 100 people or so. And this year, with it being virtual, we've increased our reach a little bit, and we're up to 334 registrations as of this morning. So, of course, people come and go as the day goes on, but it's a pretty good reach. We're really excited about that. So I'd like to thank in advance all of our speakers and panelists. So today we have 4 speakers, and then we'll have a panel discussion with those folks later on. We have another great group of speakers lined up for tomorrow as well, and appreciate the time that they've taken to put together their presentations and to be with us for this conference. Our planning team consists of a great group of folks from a lot of different organizations that have come together. We started working on this last summer, and it's taken several months to pull all this together. But we have the conference for you today. And a few guidelines for the workshop. These are the same as yesterday. For those who saw this again, bear with us for a few minutes here. This is our first time holding burning issues as a virtual event. So this is kind of a first for us. Things went well yesterday. Hope that they will again today. The only people with audio and video should be the presenters and the moderators and co-hosts. And we ask everyone else to please disable your video, keep your camera off, and mute your computer audio or your phone for the entire duration of the time today. Just because we have so many people on, over 117 now, it looks like it can get pretty busy if people start unmuting. So if you do experience technical difficulties, our first suggestion is to try just logging out, logging back in. That oftentimes will fix things. And if that doesn't work, then try sending an email to Jack McGowan-Stinsky. He's our IT and tech guy behind the scenes here. Or you send him a text message. I would recommend right now, if you have a scrap piece of paper, write down his cell phone number there, 989-287-1734. And you can always just send him a text if you're having trouble, and he can help you out, get back in. Also note that our presentations and our panels today are being recorded. And those presentations, those recordings will be available on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council web pages sometime after the workshop is over. We will be using the pre-meeting questions that people submitted along with your registration. We have a lot of questions. We obviously can't get to all of them, but we've tried to distill those down to some common themes that we saw among folks. And we'll use those to help guide some of the panel discussion later on today, along with the live question and answer. And we do monitor the chat box, and we really encourage you to post questions in the chat box. Anything that you have for the speakers while they're talking, or anytime during the discussion or during the panel, you're welcome to post questions in the chat box. Feel free to use that, and we'll keep track of that. Also, we encourage you, if you need to send a message to somebody personally directly, you can use the chat box in Zoom to send individual messages, private messages to people as well, and you're totally welcome to do that. We may not be able to answer all of your questions during each panel presentation due to time constraints, so just recognize, just because you post something on there and we don't get to it doesn't mean we didn't like your question. We probably just had 100 other ones to get to, so we'll try our best to get to as many as we can, though. Also, note that an evaluation link will be provided each day in the chat box. So kind of monitor that, and we encourage you, no matter what time you are done, even if you just watch the first talk and then get off for the rest of the day, hopefully you don't do that, but if you do, go ahead and do the evaluation then. So at any point, whenever you want to log off for the day and you're done for the session, please click on that evaluation link. It only takes you 3 or 4 minutes to get through it, and that will really help us for next year. If we do any other virtual events, or if we go back to our face-to-face, either way, those evaluations will help us. We do read every single one of them. Okay, with that, I'll kind of go over our agenda for today. We're doing our little welcome right here. We'll be done in the next probably 3 or 4 minutes. And our theme for the day is fire history in Michigan and the Great Lakes region. So we're going to start with an hour, 2 talks back to back, about an hour long total. And we'll have first David Nelson will be up to talk about climate and fire in the Midwest across the millennia, what the paleorecord tells us. And then we'll have Michael Stambaugh from University of Missouri on after that, talking about applied historical ecology of fire from Michigan and beyond. Following that, we'll have a 10-minute break. We'll come back on for another hour from 10:20 until 11:20 and continue our discussion with part 2. So we'll have the role of frequent widespread historical surface fires in Lake State's pine forests with Jed Meunier. And then we'll have Rethinking Peatland Fire, Fire History of Peatlands in the Great Lakes region with Colleen Sutheimer. And then we'll have another break, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and have all 4 of those presenters back on for a half-hour panel discussion. So focused on the questions we get in the chat as well as the questions we got in advance. So that'll be the game plan for today. We'll be wrapping up right around the noon hour. Encourage you to stay with us for tomorrow. We do have one more day of this conference tomorrow, and tomorrow's theme will be prescribed fire councils. So we're going to hear from 3 other states' prescribed fire councils, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Northern California. And then we'll hear a discussion about the Northeast Regional Prescribed Fire Council Coordinating Group. They're providing some coordination among Northeast states. And following that, kind of like today, there'll also be a panel discussion amongst those 4 speakers. And wrapping up at noon tomorrow. So 9 to noon tomorrow again. Encourage you to come back. So I think with that, it's a couple minutes early. I think we're ready to go ahead and get started though. So if David Nelson's available and ready, I'll introduce him. David Nelson is Associate Professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And I will stop sharing my screen and let David take it over from here.
All right, thanks, Glenn. Let me share my screen. And is that looking okay on your end, Glenn?
Yep, looks great.
All right, great. Well, thanks everybody for attending today. So as Glenn said, I'm a faculty member at the Appalachian Lab, which is one of 5 labs that are part of the University of Maryland's Center for Environmental Science. And you can see on this map of Maryland, we're located in far western Maryland in the Appalachian Mountains, so kind of sandwiched between Pennsylvania to the north and then West Virginia off to the west and to the south. And so today I'd like to share with you how we can extend our perspective of fire as well as climate and vegetation change using lake sediment-based paleoecological records across long centennial to millennial time periods. And so I realize this is a quite diverse audience with varied backgrounds and interests. So I've tried to keep this talk broad and accessible. So hopefully everybody takes away something new and interesting today. And so as I'll illustrate today, and as a number of scientific publications have recently emphasized, having a long-term perspective is really important in our era of rapid environmental change because it allows us to see beyond the limited time frame of direct human observations and allows us to wrap our head around how ecosystems change when climate changes. And you can see some examples of this on these maps from a recent paper showing in the mid-Holocene around 6,000 years ago, the climate was quite a bit warmer. That led to a northward shift of the tundra forest border in Eurasia. Moisture shifts led to the greening of the Sahara Desert. Or we can even go further back in time, 100,000 years ago or so, to the last interglacial, when temperatures were warm enough that we had tortoises living in central North America and the hippopotamus had expanded its range as far north as Britain. But of course, today we're going to be focusing on fire in the paleorecord. And in most ecosystems, such as grasslands, fire is nothing new. It's been occurring a long time. There's evidence of charcoal going back many millions of years in the geological record. And of course, we care about understanding how fire works because it affects and is affected by ecosystems, carbon and nutrient cycling, atmospheric chemistry, and human activities. And of course, there's been a renewed interest in fire in recent decades because we now see it occurring in places where we haven't previously seen it in the historic record, such as in the tundra, or of course, as it's causes devastation in California, the Rocky Mountains, and even more recently in the more Mesic Smoky Mountains. And so this figure from a recent paper nicely summarizes the approaches, some of the approaches we have for studying fire across different spatial and temporal scales. So temporal scale on this figure is on the x-axis and spatial scale is on the y-axis. And so at short temporal and spatial scales down here on the bottom left, we have on-the-ground monitoring. And then as we move up towards larger spatial scales, moving up that y-axis, we have historical records, and even satellite data can become useful for studying fire. However, those directly or remotely sense observations have limited temporal extent. And so to go back further in time, we need to rely on fire history reconstructions from paleoecological archives, such as tree rings or charcoal particles in lake sediments. And so this is a very active field of research involving many different research groups. So I won't by any means be able to cover everything that's going on in this field in my talk today. Instead, I want to introduce you to the types of questions that lake sediment based fire history studies can address, the methods that we use in those studies, and then provide some examples from the literature about what we've learned about climate, fire, and vegetation, focusing on the Great Plains and in the Midwestern United States. And so as this figure nicely illustrates, when we think about fire in the paleorecord, we really can't get away from thinking about climate and ecosystems as well, including interactions between fire and ecosystems, as well as the strong influence that climate has on both ecosystems and fire dynamics. And so by going further back in time, paleorecords allow us to answer questions, including some that are relevant to conservation and management, that we can't just learn from present day observations. And so just some examples of those questions I've listed here, including what's the natural variability of climate, fire, and vegetation, the novelty of current fire regimes, the response of vegetation to changes in climate and fire, as well as how vegetation and climate influence variation in fire across both spatial and temporal scales. And so we can go about addressing these types of questions using records of past ecosystem changes that are archived in geological deposits, such as lake sediments. The basic idea here is that sediments accumulate, as they accumulate on the bottom of lakes, they incorporate various environmental tracers or proxies that are produced within the lake or that are blown or washed into the lake from the surrounding landscape. And so some lakes have these beautiful annual laminations that are kind of like tree rings, and these are called varves. And so we can go about retrieving these lake sediments in various ways. We can recover them from boats on open water. Here we're on a lake in northern Michigan using a system in which we freeze the very uppermost unconsolidated sediments to this steel wedge, and then we can quickly transfer them to the mud to a freezer box. We can also wait for ice to form in the winter and then go out and core. This is a system we use for retrieving the deeper sediments in meter-long sections. And here we're coring a lake up in Minnesota. And believe it or not, another really nice way to core lake sediments is from dry land. This is a site in central Illinois called Chatsworth Bog that I studied for my dissertation research. It was formerly a shallow lake, but the bog was tiled and drained, and the site is currently an agricultural field. But below the top meter of soil, there's beautiful and undisturbed lake sediments. And so we bring the cores back to the lab, take subsamples of those different layers of the sediments, and then can analyze things in the mud like charcoal to determine changes in the importance of fire through time, and sometimes even fire frequency and biomass burned in certain settings. Similarly, different types of plants have different pollen morphologies, and so we can quantify pollen percentages in the different layers of the sediments to assess changes in plant community composition through time. And we can look at lots of different proxy indicators to reconstruct past changes in climate, including things like diatom assemblages, minerals in the sediments, isotopes, and lake levels. And so what we end up with all these different proxies are time series that look sort of like the figures here on the right, that show time on one axis and then the proxy data on the other axis. And so we can put these data in a chronological framework. Most typically we do that using carbon-14 dating. So this figure is just an example of this, with depth on the core on the y-axis, with top of the core at the top of the y-axis, and then going down 12 meters to the bottom of the core. Age is on the x-axis from present on the left to 11,000 years ago on the right. And then the different carbon-14 dates are the circles with error bars, which we can then fit a model to those dates. In this case, the model is represented by the orange curve. We do that, which allows us to ascribe an age to every depth in the core. So I'd like to move on now. We'll focus more on some examples and some work that's been done in the Great Plains and the Midwest. Start with this example of the real landmark paper on the climate, vegetation, and fire history of the Northern Great Plains. This was published about 10 years ago from Kettle Lake in northwestern North Dakota, that was led by Eric Grimm, who's pictured on this slide. Unfortunately, Eric passed away late last year, but he was a great friend and colleague and mentor to so many of us in the field. And so this work that Eric led was a real landmark for several reasons, including its use of multiple different proxy indicators, as well as the incredibly high temporal resolution at which those proxies were measured in the core. And so this figure that you're looking at on the left shows pollen data from this site. Time is on the y-axis, going back, present is at the top, and then going back 13,000 years ago on the bottom. And then the percentages of different pollen types are shown on the x-axis. The major pollen types we see in this diagram are grasses and herbaceous species such as ambrosia and artemisia, which tells us that this site has been a grassland throughout its history, throughout the last 11, 12,000 years. So in addition to the long, there's certainly some long millennial scale variations in this core, but I think what's most interesting about this record and these data is the high frequency decadal scale variations in the pollen percentages. They just go back and forth very frequently. And so what the authors found when they compared these pollen data with independent measures of aridity that they deduced from the mineral composition of the sediments is that these decadal scale variations in pollen are responsive vegetation to multi-decadal drought variability. So basically you have 40 to 50 years of drought that are alternating with 40 to 50 years of wetter conditions. And so the droughts had less grasses, more weedy species such as ambrosia, and less charcoal. The wet periods had more charcoal because there was more grassy fuels that were abundant and continuous on the landscape. And so this tells us that this is a fuel-limited fire regime that's occurred at this site over the last 10,000 or so years. Another kind of interesting feature of this pollen record is that we see in this pollen record is what's known as non-analog plant communities. We often see these communities in forests from the older late glacial portion of pollen records from the Midwestern United States, but here we see them more recently during the middle of the Holocene, between about 9 and 4,000 or so years ago. And what we mean by non-analog is that these are assemblages of plants that don't occur anywhere on the modern landscape. And what's non-analog about this pollen diagram are these really high and variable percentages of ambrosia ragweed, again, during the middle Holocene. And these high and variable percentages of ambrosia are really paradoxical because today, the ambrosia species on the Great Plains are not drought tolerant, but yet we find them most commonly, ambrosia abundance is highest during the middle Holocene, which we know is an overall dry period, and ambrosia is also most abundant during the dry phases of these multi-decadal droughts that occurred throughout the middle and late Holocene. So Eric proposed in this paper that the explanation for these shifts in vegetation composition involved high interannual variability of moisture that were overlaid on the multi-decadal droughts. So the idea here is that the 40 to 50 years of drought that we see in the sediment record may not have been 40 to 50 years of continuous drought, but rather a series of decadal or subdecadal droughts that were interspersed with wet summers that ambrosia was able to take advantage of. So these communities were probably non-analog because they experienced recurring droughts that repeatedly disturbed the vegetation and created favorable conditions for ambrosia during alternating wet summers. And that's something we haven't seen in the historical record. All right, so with that as an example from the Great Plains, I'd like to move further east, and we'll focus the rest of the talk on some examples of paleo records from the Midwest. And first focusing on this question about the role of climate and fire in the development and maintenance of grassland in the Midwestern United States, and specifically in the tallgrass prairie peninsula. And before the last examples I'll show towards the end of the talk, we'll focus on more forested regions of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so you can see the Prairie Peninsula on this map of pre-settlement vegetation where the tallgrass prairie in yellow extends out into the deciduous forest in Illinois and western parts of Indiana, with forests largely restricted to locations near fire breaks, such as lakes and streams. And so throughout the 20th century, ecologists and biogeographers sought explanations for the origin and persistence of the Prairie Peninsula because it was believed that the climate of the region was better suited for supporting forests than grasslands. And so there was many hypotheses made that prior to European settlement, the region may have been capable of supporting forests in the absence of frequent fires ignited by Native Americans. Of course, these authors realized that this was just a hypothesis that they didn't have the data to adequately address. So it's kind of interesting, in contrast to the heterogeneous mix of prairie and forest in the Prairie Peninsula, you can see that in the more western regions of the prairie forest border, such as in Minnesota, the transition from prairie to forest is typically much more abrupt and marked, suggesting that fire may not have been as important of a driver, a control of vegetation dynamics here. So for my dissertation research a number of years ago now, I decided to take up this question of how climate and fire influenced prairie development and maintenance. And so I did this by collecting and comparing paleoenvironmental records of climate, vegetation, and fire from lake sediments in the western part of the tallgrass prairie region in Minnesota, and then a couple other sites down in Illinois. So the pair of sites in Minnesota are West Olaf Lake, WOL, and Steel Lake, SL. And then the sites in Illinois are Chatsworth Bog, CB, and Nelson Lake, NL. And no, I did not name Nelson Lake after myself. And so I focused my study of these records on the Middle Holocene around, as I said earlier, around 9,000 to 4,000 years ago, which was when prior studies suggested that grassland had expanded in this area, but those studies didn't have high enough temporal sampling or independent paleoclimate or fire history reconstructions with which to really address this question. All right, so getting into the results, what did I find? So I analyzed a number of different proxies of past aridity. And so the way that the data are plotted on these graphs are values toward the bottom of the y-axis indicate wetter conditions, and values towards the top part of the y-axis indicate drier conditions. And then time is on the x-axis from 10,000 years ago on the left to 3,000 years ago on the right. And the different colors just represent data from the different sites. And so what you can see is that sites within each region show quite similar patterns through time, indicating that these records are showing similar moisture fluctuations within each region, within Minnesota and within Illinois. And so in Minnesota, we inferred from oxygen isotope data and sediment mineral composition that there was an abrupt onset of aridity just after 8,000 years ago, and then a general decline through time, certainly some short-term variability, but generally a decline in aridity, so increase in moisture through time. In Illinois, the pattern is quite different. We inferred, this is a composite aridity record. We looked at a lot of different aridity proxies and then put them all together into a single record at each site. And so we see fluctuations in aridity through time, from relatively wet to dry, wet, dry, and so on. But there's no long-term trend here in Illinois like we saw in Minnesota. So there was variability in when conditions became dry during the Middle Holocene throughout the Midwest. And so if climate was a strong control of these vegetation dynamics along the prairie forest border, then we'd expect to see quite different variations in plant community composition between Minnesota and between Illinois. So this figure is a summary of the vegetation variations that we see from each site. And so let me just walk you through it. We're looking at here at percent non-arboreal pollen on this axis here, from the two sites in Minnesota at the top, the two sites in Illinois towards the bottom, and again through time from 10,000 years ago on the left to 3,000 years ago on the right. And so non-arboreal pollen is the sum of all pollen types that are not trees, so primarily prairie grasses and forbs. So first off, we see very similar patterns within regions, but quite different patterns between Minnesota and in Illinois. So in Minnesota, what we see is both sites display peaks of herbaceous plants around just after 8,000 years ago, and then a general decline through time as woody taxa expanded. In contrast, the sites in Illinois down here at the bottom show this initial expansion of prairie taxa From around 9,000 to around 7,500 years ago, prairie then retreated, as indicated by declining non-arboreal pollen percentages, and then the much larger expansion of grassland vegetation occurred after around 6,200 years ago in Illinois. So when prairie was retreating in Minnesota around 6,000 years ago, it was expanding in the eastern Prairie Peninsula. So what specifically was the role of aridity and fire on prairie expansion and contraction in these two areas? To look at that, I'm going to just show you data from one site from each region, just to keep things simple, but we see similar patterns at both sites in each state, which gives us confidence that the patterns we're seeing occurred regionally. And so this slide shows data from West Olaf Lake in Minnesota, with time on the x-axis. Here we're zooming in a little bit, so looking just 8,000 years ago on the left to 4,000 years ago on the right. And what we see is a long-term decrease in aridity, inferred from sediment mineral composition, expansion of grasses on the landscape, and decreased abundance of weedy species such as ambrosia, along with increasing fires on the landscape. And so the long-term trends in these data are very similar to the patterns we looked at earlier from Kettle Lake on the Great Plains, with very arid conditions leading to decreased abundance of grasses, expansion of weedy species, and then limited fuel availability. Only as moisture increased towards the latter part of this, the middle hole is seen here in this record, did moisture increase, grass productivity increase, which led to increased fuel loads. So these results tell us that aridity was the primary driver of the expansion of grassland into Minnesota, and that shifts in fire were simply a response to changes in fuel availability. In Illinois, we see a somewhat different pattern. So this figure shows the aridity record from Illinois that I showed earlier, along with percent non-arboreal pollen, and then the charcoal influx. Again, time is on the x-axis from 10,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago. And remember, you've seen the aridity record and the non-arboreal pollen data on the last couple slides. So there's a general similarity between aridity and non-arboreal pollen, such as the expansion of grassland around 9,000 years ago during a period of drier conditions, and then the contraction of prairie around 7,000 years ago when conditions became wetter, indicating that moisture certainly had an influence on prairie expansion in Illinois. But there's also evidence that fire may have aided the establishment and maintenance of prairie in the region. So for example, charcoal accumulation rates indicate increased fire importance around 7,200 years ago, which is about 1,000 years before the increase in aridity and increase in grassland taxes 6,200 years ago, suggesting that increased ignitions may have resulted in more burns and contributed to prairie expansion in Illinois, because conditions weren't any drier at 6,000 years ago than 8,000 years ago, but yet we see much more abundant grassland prairie being much more abundant after 6,000 years ago. Additionally, there's this marked increase in effective moisture centered on 5,500 years ago, which didn't cause woody taxa to expand, is indicated by little change in percent non-arboreal pollen you can see here. And that's probably because fires remained important, as indicated by relatively high charcoal accumulation rates. So these results suggest that in contrast to Minnesota, fire was also an important player in the development and expansion of tallgrass prairie in the eastern Prairie Peninsula, consistent with the speculations by the early 20th century ecologists. So I'd like to wrap up looking at some records from more forested regions of the Midwest. This is an example of a recent paper that used a Bayesian vegetation pollen model to look at changes in forest composition in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan over the last couple of thousand years. And so the colors on these graphs indicate taxa that experienced the greatest change in abundance in any grid cell between 2,100 years ago and 300 years ago, where the authors define large changes and changes in greater than 5% pollen abundance. So regions of statistically significant large change are outlined in black. And then the white regions that are outlined in black indicate significant stability. If there's regions that are not outlined in black and they're white, indicate regions where no taxa changed by more than 5%, but these areas were also not significantly stable. So the authors found some areas of significant change during the last couple thousand years, such as the filling in of hemlock in central northern Wisconsin, expansion of beech in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But overall, there were significant changes in only 9% of the grid cells in this study. Most cells had vegetation composition that was not significantly stable or unstable. So overall, the spatial and temporal patterns of forest dynamics were complex, and any large changes in vegetation were occurring against this regional background of relatively small changes during the last couple thousand years. And so when we look at fire history records from this region, we see plenty of charcoal during the last couple thousand years, indicating that fire occurred up until 20th century fire suppression began. And in general, these prior studies show more fire during drought periods, specifically during the medieval climate anomaly around 1,000 to about 700 years ago, when conditions were drier, suggesting the fire regime was climate controlled. So in conjunction with the prior slide indicating relatively minor vegetation changes, this would imply that the plant communities were largely resilient to shifts in fire during this time. Now, if we jump across Lake Michigan to the lower peninsula of Michigan, here we can see evidence of vegetation being less resilient to droughts and fire during these medieval climate anomaly droughts. So this was a study of vegetation, fire, and hydroclimate conducted at Irwin Smith Bog. It's represented by the number 2 on this map here. And so the data are over here on the left. Time is on the x-axis from 2,000 years ago on the left to present on the right. And the top panel shows the author's record of aridity. The next panel shows the charcoal data. And then the bottom 3 panels show pollen, beech pollen at the top, pine pollen in the middle, and then hemlock at the bottom. And so they saw these multi-decadal droughts during the medieval climate anomaly. These are represented by these yellow vertical bars here. And interestingly, each of these droughts was associated with fire events as indicated by peaks in the charcoal. In fact, the first fire seems to have burned off several hundred years of peat accumulation, as there's a gap in the core. And so the droughts and fires were also associated with declines in beech pollen and expansion of pine. So drought and fire played a role in these beech declines, which occurred throughout this region during the medieval climate anomaly, which you can see here on the red colors on this map, indicating how much the relative abundance of beech declined from before to after the medieval climate anomaly. So these results suggest that this region may be more vulnerable to drought than we would likely think, since it's been fairly wet during the last century. So one other major environmental factors that influence plant communities in lower Michigan are lake effect snow and landform type. So I want to wrap up with one more study from Michigan, where my colleague Paul Henney did his PhD research, investigating the influence of the establishment of lake effect snow relative to landform types such as till and outwash on forest communities. So to do this, Paul cored 2 lakes within the modern lake effect snowbelt, and 2 others that are located outside of the present-day snowbelt. One lake within each snowfall regime was on till, and the other was on outwash. And so what you're looking at here are summaries of the pollen diagrams from each of these 4 sites. Pine is on the right, hemlock in the middle, and then mesic hardwoods on the left. The 2 sites in the snowbelt are in gray, and the sites outside the snowbelt are in black. The till sites are solid lines, and the dashes represent the outwash sites. And then time, again, is on the y-axis from the present at top back 12,000 years on the bottom. So you can see that pine forest communities expanded synchronously across all these sites around 11,000 to 10,000 years ago. And then these pine forests persisted for the entire record outside of the snowbelt, represented by the sites in the black lines. But it's a different story at sites inside the present-day snowbelt, where you can see that around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, there was an initial expansion of mesic vegetation on both till and outwash. And so in a prior work Paul had done using oxygen isotopes, he showed that lake effect snow in lower Michigan began to establish around 9,000 to 5,500 years ago, which suggests that the expansion of mesic vegetation inside the present-day snowbelt resulted from the snowbelt becoming established. So overall, these data indicate differences in snowfall abundance were more important to the development of mesic hardwood forests in northern lower Michigan than variation in landform or regional climate change. And they suggest future changes in mesic forest communities surrounding the Great Lake are likely to depend on the response of vegetation of lake effect snow to climate warming. And I'm sure you're wondering about charcoal data from these sites. They don't currently exist, but we're in the process of generating them. And our hypothesis is we'll see more frequent burning outside of the snow belt and on the drier soils. So just to recap, I hope I've shown how lake sediment records can extend and expand our perspectives of climate, fire, and vegetation. Also, hopefully shown that climate can directly drive fire, but that relationship can also be indirect through the effect of climate on vegetation. And finally, that fire can also itself be a driver of vegetation change. I also showed that unique climates can create non-analog plant communities, which if they occur in the future could certainly present some new management and conservation challenges. And finally, the results I presented today suggest that regions in the Midwest that are relatively humid today are susceptible to drought and fire. And so we may be underestimating drought and fire risk in these areas as our climate continues to warm. And that's all I have. If there's any time, I'll be happy to take any questions.
All right, yeah, if we have any other questions, go ahead and post those in the chat. We haven't had a ton come in yet. We had one question in there. So during this time, we see a warming trend that did not provide freeze over of the lakes. So I assume it's referring to the Great Lakes and whether or not they froze over, and you think that has any influence on what happened?
With the establishment of lake effect snow, I'm guessing that's referring to. I think the major thing going on, lake levels were a lot lower in the early Holocene, and you had the ice sheet continuing to disintegrate. So as atmospheric circulation patterns changed and the lake levels rose, with a warming climate, of course, in the mid-Holocene, I think that's the major, it was a gradual process that as lake effect snow. It wasn't just like suddenly it kicked on one day. It was, I think this Paul's data, I didn't show the isotope data, but kind of showed that it was kind of a gradual ramp up of lake effect snow. But by around 5,000 years ago, I think that's about when the modern kind of snowfall regime started.
Okay, cool, thanks. I don't see any other questions in there. I jotted down a couple notes myself here. Did you see anything that, I don't know if this was a species that you looked at or a group in oaks at all in Michigan? Did you see any differences or changes over time, or that not really come up?
Oh, in the last study there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's a ton of oak pollen at the sites Paul was looking at. I think, if you go further south, obviously that would come up.
Yeah. And
then people often wonder about oaks. We can only say that it's oak pollen, so unfortunately that's one of those taxa that we can't go any further down in terms of to find our taxonomic resolution. So
yeah, okay, cool. All right, looks like we got a couple more questions in here. Yeah, Andy?
Yeah, we got a question just about how, what's the resolution on your Pinus genus in the pollen records? Can you dive into the different species a little bit more? The comment says that Pinus strobus, that they imagine Pinus strobus may have acted divergent to Pinus banksiana, for example. So,
yeah, great question. We can differentiate white from red and jack, and so what Paul's data showed, I'd have to. So I believe what he showed is outside the snow belt on the more drier soils, so the outwash soils, you did have more. You had more jack and red, whereas in more the more western sites inside the snow belt, you had more white pine. Once the snow belt kind of kicked on, I think at the beginning of all those records, it was mostly white pine, and then the white pine kind of hung on in the snow belt, and then especially outside the snow belt on the drier soils, you had more jack and red.
All right, great. So a couple more in there. I think it's getting about time though. We'll need to move over to our next presenter. So we'll keep these questions in mind for our panel discussion a little bit later on. All right, well, thanks a lot. And all right, well, next up we have Michael Stambaugh, Associate Research Professor at the School of Natural Resources at the University of Missouri. Take it away, Mike.
Okay, can you hear me? All right. Well, I appreciate that talk by Dr. Nelson. It certainly puts, I think, some of the data I'm going to talk about today into a broader context, which I very much appreciate, especially when you think about non-analog communities and how everything I may present is on some bigger trajectory as he covered today. Okay, so I briefly want to cover what is commonly called applied historical ecology, and give you some examples of uses of applied historical ecology from the fire scar history record, and then hopefully get to some parting thoughts on fire ecology and management within Michigan. Applied historical ecology, if you've not heard that term before, I really encourage you to look into this probably foundational publication by Sutheimer et al. And some of this was also covered by Dr. Nelson, in that where we live today and how we live today certainly aren't the way the things always were or were just in the recent past, and that we really need to have a broader historical perspective to understand our landscapes and to provide a reference for management. Especially since many of the species that we manage still have the same historical and ecological requirements that they've always had, despite the modern day landscape and activities being very different. And one of my favorite examples is of what many people call the Great Disruption, or the entering of the Anthropocene. One of my favorite examples is this kind of series of repeat photos, more or less, from the Chequamegon Nicolet in central Wisconsin. On the top left, you see probably one of the first photos of what was probably a pine barrens or pine woodland, had a strong herbaceous component. You see two kind of pine snags there in the middle ground. At the next panel on the top right, you can see those two pine snags here still. The area being planted in red pine. The transition to the bottom left, you see this plantation growing up into, on the bottom right, what is likely the condition today. Whereas, you may think that this is a red pine ecosystem, and should be managed in certain ways that promote a red pine, whereby if you were to kind of go back in time, maybe 100 years prior, you might think that this is much more of a herbaceous dominated ecosystem that may have a very different ecology and disturbance regime. As well as, I think this is a kind of a common theme across much of the eastern United States, that many of our systems are much more forested than they were just a couple hundred years ago, due to altered disturbance regimes. And I usually stop there, but added this kind of next pictograph, because I think really the underlying thing that we should be thinking about are the changes in what the primary driver has been over the last couple hundred years. And that has been changes in people, populations, and the activities. And so applied historical ecology, a lot of people get hung up on the fact that they think that we're trying to manage land like it used to be at some precondition. And really, applied historical ecology is really just advocating for understanding historical processes, how they drove patterns and species, and use that information in forest management or fire management to set goals that are achievable. And I think a lot of people really advocate for this in different ways. Probably Aldo Leopold was one of the best at stating this in terms of keeping all the pieces and parts, but many people since then really, I think, advocate for much broader management, from going from individual species or just trees to entire ecosystems and processes. And my research primarily focuses again on fire scar history, And I've been lucky enough to do this throughout the Eastern United States, where I think has been very enlightening, particularly to me and hopefully to others, in that there's a tremendous amount of evidence of historical fire in the Eastern United States that's still on the landscape through these preserved and old trees, as well as the charcoal and fire scars on them. And so you can see these images kind of are plotted by geography throughout the US. Many of these are hard pines, but some of these are also oaks. And they're really the fire history in terms of fire scar history in the Eastern United States is really no different than what you might find in the Western US or other parts of the globe. And fire scars are, as Dr. Nelson mentioned, they're kind of unique in that they are absolutely dated to the exact year, in some cases to the season of the year. So with that high kind of resolution data, as well as high spatial resolution, meaning we know exactly where these scars are, we can really get at almost all of the characteristics of a fire regime that we use to kind of classify fire regimes as well as manage land. And those would be fire seasonality, fire size and extent, the spatial complexity of fires, how severe or intense those historical fires were, what types of fires were they? Were they surface fires or were they ground fires? And then probably what is probably most emphasized is how frequent were those fires through time. And so these fire scars give us lots of information about individual site data. In the last decade or so, we've seen increasing numbers of fire scar studies across particularly the Eastern United States. And these are being combined into what I call, or what others might call, networks of mini sites, which allow us to now address some of the larger scale drivers of fire regimes, from landscapes to even regions, and look at the influences of climate and humans, vegetation and topography. And so on the bottom left here, I show a map of the Eastern United States with some different citations that are studies that have really, I think, done really great jobs at utilizing these networks of fire scar sites to get at changes in human populations in fire, changes in fire sizes over landscape. So I'll leave this here. Hopefully there's a recording so people can refer back to maybe some of these citations to look at these different studies of networks of fire scar data. I just kind of want to cover a little bit about how fire scars are formed. So what you're seeing here on the bottom left is kind of looking down on the surface of a tree. And imagine these are the tree rings. And when a fire passes by a tree, typically there's a heat vortex on the leeward side of the tree. This might be the upslope side of the tree. And a fire scar would be formed due to the killing of the cambium. And that's shown here in red. And so subsequent years of growth cannot occur, obviously, from this killed cambium area. And so you have this curling tissue effect that covers over the fire scar. And this is actually a fairly common situation where in low severity fires or patchy fires, or even infrequent fire regimes, where you will have trees where from the outside you can see no fire scars, but on the inside there are embedded fire scars. Some examples of this might be in oaks or, for example, in white pine. The other kind of situation is where you would have a fire scar and maybe fires are frequent enough that you would have a second fire scar, keeping this injury open and able to kind of record multiple fires on an individual tree. And this is common in many of the hard pine systems, such as red pine, shortleaf pine, even in some cases, oaks. And so we can use these scars on these individual rings to date the years to the exact calendar year. And here are just a couple of sections. The top one is white oak species. So white oak, bur oak, post oak, chinkapin oak. These are all very good species for using to do fire history reconstructions. And then on the bottom, probably what we'll hear a lot about today, including in my talk, is red pine. So here you can see the different injuries from fires on this red pine through the 1700s. Commonly how this research is done is somewhat opportunistically. There's a lot of different historical land uses that have occurred that have really kind of erased and changed these historical forests. Remnant trees and logs and stumps are not available everywhere. So it's kind of like where you can find them is often what drives where some of this research is done. And this is a cartoon example of perhaps a study area that includes, again, some of these standing snags, down logs and live trees. And we would go into these areas and collect as much information, wood samples, as well as vegetation information as possible to reconstruct the history of fires. In this, we might choose small and large trees to make sure that we capture some of the scarring dynamics, as well as some of the younger and older trees to make sure that we have good replication through time. And this is kind of an actual photograph of what you might see. Similar to that cartoon, here's a red pine stand. You see these fire scarred stumps. Some of them still have charcoal on them. Here's a down log with fire scars on it. Here's an old live tree with a fire scar. And then of course you have these younger trees that have grown in a fire suppression era that have probably no fire scars on them. This is a different example. Many of the pine sites have the ability to preserve trees for hundreds of years, even over 500 years in some cases. Some of the hardwood sites are much more difficult to obtain fire histories from due to the rates of decay of the wood and what that does to the ability to view fire scars. Oftentimes in oak sites, we would follow up on, say, a harvest, or in this case is a wildfire, where we can go in and kind of cut trees as we wish soon after the trees have died, so that the wood has not been compromised and you can still see the fire scars. Again, much of this work is opportunistic sampling. And trying to do as best we can to spatially distribute the sampling across a large area, as well as kind of capture the vegetation conditions in which that we see as we are sampling. Here we are cutting cross sections in an oak stand on the right, making sure we get very close to the ground. In many of the oak forests that we work in doing fire scar analysis, fire scars are very short, so it's critical to be collecting samples right at the ground line. So we go into a stand, we cut a section out of a stump like this one on the top left. We orient these sections in terms of the slope, as well as their directional orientation to north. They're GPSed in location, brought back to the laboratory where they're all polished so that we can see all the rings. We measure all these rings to high precision to generate a growth curve like this shown in green that we can then use to match up against the growth patterns of living trees. So this chart here shows the growth pattern of the forest in which this sample was taken, and then we cross-match this growth pattern so that we know exactly when in time that stump was growing. And then we can assign all the rings, the years to the rings, and then we go back over the fire scars and we can assign all the years of the fire scars. And in this case, this is actually a cross-section of an oak tree, showing the different fire scars back into the 1600s on this oak. All those fire scars can be compiled. And so this is probably a chart you'll see more in future talks, but what you're looking at is a timeline from about 1500 up to 2000 here on the bottom. And then each of these horizontal lines represents the period of growth for an individual tree. So here at this site, there's about 30 trees listed. And then each of these bold ticks represents the fire scar on those different trees. And what you can see through time is these changes in fire events as you go forward, as well as changes in frequency. I'll talk more about that. And when you look a little closer at the fire scar, you can see exactly how it's positioned within the year. So when fire scars are positioned between years, you would have the complete ring here on the bottom right, and then the fire scar would happen right after that year of growth. And the beginning of the next year's growth is right where the fire scar would occur. And that's what you'd expect if the fire occurred when the tree was dormant. Versus on the left, all these are fire scars occurring while the tree is growing. So you can see the different levels of wood formation here right before the fire happens. So this would be our early season scar where there's just a little bit of wood formed before the scar is formed. This is a middle early wood scar. So you see a little more wood formed and then the scar, and so on and so forth. Here's an example of a fire scar on an oak tree. And the fire scar here is indicated in red. And what you see is a dormant season scar because the ring before it is completely formed. And then on the opposite side of this scar, you see the formation of the early wood vessels, which indicates the growth in a new year. So in this case, this is the example of a dormant season scar on a white oak. Conversely, this is a growing season scar where on the opposite side of the fire scar here, again shown in red, you see the tree is still forming this late wood before the next year is beginning. So in this case, this would be likely a summer season fire scar in oak. And then outside of just the fire scars themselves, there's just a tremendous amount of information, I think, that we haven't done a very good job of capturing, but is represented on the physical specimen in the field. And some of that includes the amount of the tree that has been killed, so the circumference killed, as well as the scar height. These are important pieces of information in terms of what types of fires were occurring to create these sizes of injuries. And also in this case, you see my hand is here at the top of this tree, showing that despite having these fire scars, someone still thought that this tree had value and removed this log from the top of this very tall stump. Also giving us an indication that despite all this fire activity, there can still be a valuable product at the top of this scarred tree. So this bottom left map shows kind of the current status of fire scar history sites throughout North America. And then above this in the map here, showing the lake states, you can see the distribution of fire scar data sets across the lake states. And you can see that there's quite a good distribution of sites, particularly in Wisconsin and up into the Boundary Waters area. The UP of Michigan is starting to get filled in, and very little fire scar data available from the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. Certainly there's a tremendous potential there. On the top, or on the right side here, I'm showing the pre-settlement vegetation as according to the General Land Office survey notes and corresponding to some of this current activity of fire scar research. Most of this research is being focused within red pine systems. Very little is being done within other systems such as oak or some of the northern hardwood systems. As well as, even though there are some sites in the UP of Michigan, much of this data is very recent or still forthcoming. And so in many cases, there's very, very little current information for fire scar history in Michigan, despite there being a tremendous potential. So probably some of the first evidence we have or inkling of what fire frequencies were prior to European influence has come from expert opinion and models. And on the left here is a publication by Cecil Frost in 1998, where he estimated fire frequencies based on vegetation and the relationship of vegetation with fire. And he's showing here for the UP as well as the Lower Peninsula areas dominated by 26 to 100 year long fire intervals. Again, this is a very coarse scale, and this was more done for a continental look, but here showing a fairly long fire intervals across some of these regions. On the bottom right here, this is the land fire estimates of mean fire interval, historical mean fire interval, showing I think 30-meter resolution data for the region, showing much more variability, particularly in the Lower Peninsula, where many of the areas that were historically pine dominated, red pine dominated, having fire intervals of somewhere between 20 to 50 years. But again, very long intervals, particularly in the UP, as well as some parts of the Lower Peninsula. And then at the top right here is a modeling effort that I worked on with Dr. Rich Guyette and others. This is a model that's calibrated based on fire scar data throughout the US and climate. And we predict through that model much more frequent fire historically, particularly for the Lower Peninsula, but even areas of the Upper Peninsula. In the Lower Peninsula, our model suggests that fire frequency was below 10 years for large portions of that Lower Peninsula, and then into the Upper Peninsula, also much of the region being suggesting mean fire intervals historically of less than 30 years across much of that landscape. But again, there's little data. So I want to touch on just a study that I worked on here. This is in the Huron Mountains in the UP. The location is indicated here in the bottom, this locator map. It's here on the edge of Lake Superior. In this landscape, we have 7 sites that are indicated here by these diamonds, ranging from near the lakeshore on this beach and Paleo Beach up into this kind of interlake area, and then one site here, Burnt Mountain, on a mountaintop. And so we use fire scars on red pines throughout this landscape to reconstruct the years in which fires occurred, and we documented high variability across this region. So on the top left, we have a record from 1500 up to about 1900, based on dead red pine trees. And what you can see is kind of a very heterogeneous and low scarring activity on many of these trees throughout the site. You have a period here in the late 1500s where there's almost 100 years without recording a fire scar. And then contrasting that with this period in the early 1800s where annual burning was occurring. And just 5 kilometers away, maybe, Down on the lakeshore, we have a very different fire regime within kind of the same landscape, where we see fire events being much more synchronous across trees. We see many trees scarred within individual fire years, as well as kind of a much more regular pattern in fire frequency through time. This table, these data and tables are listed in the publication here, Music et al. But this table gives the mean fire intervals that we see prior to 1752. And so we're seeing fire frequency on average anywhere from maybe 20 to 50 years at these individual sites, with fire frequency increasing after that period up to a period of fire suppression, which was right around the beginning in 1900. So at the top here, we're seeing these kind of individual sites, very different sites again within this small landscape. When we look at all sites across this landscape, so all 7 of those diamonds on the map, and plot all the data, this is the fire frequency that we see generated. So you see, if you classify fire frequency on a much larger spatial scale, you're coming up with a much more frequent fire activity. And you can really see kind of through time the change in fire frequency right around 1750, which is a pattern that we see commonly throughout the Lake States region, which is kind of a major transition in fire frequency right around 1750. Interestingly, we see some of these fire years where there's many trees scarred. They're followed kind of by or paired with a fire either right before or right after that event. And as well as some sustained periods where we see a fire every year somewhere in the landscape for maybe up to a decade in time.
Hey, Mike, just to let you know, you got about 3 minutes left.
Okay, I'm just going to bump down to one other. I think I packed in too much info. One other site. We're working currently in the Lower Peninsula, and this is preliminary data. This is a report by Rich Guyette, who's since retired, and we're leading some of these sites that he initiated. This is a fire scar history chart here at the bottom, spanning from about 1650 to 1850. These are red pines, remnant red pines that are still in kind of a red pine stand here in the Baldwin White Cloud district. And again, we're seeing ample fire activity, certainly potential to do fire history across this part of the Lower Peninsula. And within these preliminary data, we're seeing fire intervals, depending on how you cut the data up, anywhere from 13 to 19 years as an average from the period 1682 to 1836. And so I'm just going to bump down here to some acknowledgements. Certainly these data aren't just generated in a vacuum. Many people have contributed to a fire scar history research, not only in the Lake States, but beyond, and certainly appreciate their support. And with these other studies, it certainly provides a broader perspective for fire scar history and fire regimes within Michigan. So with that, I'll end.
All right, well, thank you very much. It is time for our scheduled break. We had a few more questions come in, and we'll hold those to the panel discussion at the end. I think we had some really good questions come in, so we're definitely making note of those, and we'll bring those up a little bit later. So we'll move into our 10-minute break here from 10:10 until 10:20. So I guess Jack has a little slide for us to put up, and appreciate your presentation today, Dr. Stambaugh, and we'll talk to you again in a little bit. We'll see everybody in about 10 minutes. All right, we'll get started again in about 1 more minute. All right, I want to welcome everyone back. Hopefully you had a good break. About 10 minutes there. So we'll go ahead and get back started. We have 2 more presentations this morning, and then we'll have our panel discussion after that. So next up is Jed Meunier, from a Disturbance Ecologist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Division of Forestry. And he's going to talk about the role of frequent widespread historical surface fires in the Lake State's pine forests. Take it away, Jed.
All right, Glenn, can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you great.
All right, my slides are coming through like they should. This is great, and I really think that the last 2 presentations will set up the next 2, mine and Colleen's coming up really well. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Hey, Jed.
Yeah.
We're seeing your presenter view. I guess maybe just swap it on your screen. We got the, like, your next slide and the slide. So.
Oh, hold on. I think, well, let me see that.
Yeah, I think if you go to display settings.
Yeah, I got the different monitors. Okay.
Swap. Yep.
Does that look better?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. Okay, great. So I'll jump in here. I don't have a crystal ball or a time machine, but what I do have is a chainsaw. And I think what Mike sort of set up and sort of some of the methods that he outlined with tree ring research is where I'll be going with this to try and understand fire in our region. So this is a really good starting place. I think I was involved with a fire needs assessment in Wisconsin, and I know Michigan has done similar things. It was a comprehensive view of where we have the best opportunity to manage fire dependent communities and sort of a cost benefit framework. And I'm not going to go into any details here, but 2 things that I think are important. The first one is this number, right? So we basically found that we need to be burning about 1 million acres per year to maintain what we've got. So that's a big number and lofty, but is something that I'm going to probably focus my comments on this talk more. I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about these various communities other than to say that we have a lot of opportunity outside of the traditional oak savanna, tall grass prairie, where we've dedicated a lot of time and energy in recent decades. So my remarks are really for forests. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of splitting of details of different communities, but they're pine dominated forests. They cover the gamut of very well drained jack pine dominated outwash sands to really productive dry mesic, maybe even pushing towards the mesic end of heavy white pine, et cetera. So pine forests. And I really love this picture. It's grainy even when it's not projected or coming through virtual in a presentation, but hopefully in the bottom of this picture, you can see 3 figures standing against charred trunks of pine trees. So this is a mixed conifer stand in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So the picture is actually taken from the UP. The quote, however, is part of the geologic survey in the late 1800s, taken from the Northwest Sands of Wisconsin. Excuse me. So I think this scenario is more common than we even appreciate. So, I've spent some time evaluating this picture. I've counted pretty much every discernible tree stem in it, estimated the area, et cetera. But what I can tell you is that, one, there are basal injuries that Mike talked about. So this forest had fire, frequent fire probably. And the other thing is that it is indeed a forest, right? It's not a savanna or a woodland based on density. And this is somewhat of an academic debate, but essentially we're not talking about a savanna or a barrens or even a woodland. We're talking about a forest, a closed canopy forest, but where fire was prevalent. And so those systems, basically we leveled them, and that what Mike talked about in this period of just epic land use changes. So we had wiped out our pine forests before we had much of a chance to understand them. Lee Frelich estimates that 0.6% of quote unquote relatively intact pines remain. That again is I mean, I think what he's talking about is natural origin pines. So we have very little remaining, and Lisa Schulte Moore and others have told us that we basically have our pine systems have not recovered. And to carry that picture forward to the present, this is what we are looking at. When most people think of red pine, certainly, maybe even pine generally, they're often thinking about straight rows. So this is how the vast majority of our pine looks in the Great Lakes region. And what's important about this is that we manage our natural origin red pine exactly like a pine plantation. There's almost no difference. We basically have passive management. In the plantation setting, we may thin every other tree, every other row, but it's relatively it's a system of punctuated mortality and punctuated recruitment. So we're planting for the punctuated recruitment in the pine plantation example, but we think about natural origin pine the same way. We think that wind events and severe fire wiped these stands out, and you had a generation pulse, they're even aged, etc. So essentially, there's similar systems to these managed pine plantations. And that last bullet there, I'll just touch on. So, we've been in the best of the best, the 0.6 that Lee Frelich talked about with our study sites. So natural origin pine, and we're basically seeing no regeneration. I don't think that's surprising to most people who've been around these systems. And so I have the luxury of not going into great detail on the methods, but needless to say that we've been out in the woods and running a chainsaw and trying to get a picture of these systems. So I'm going to kind of merge data here, but we have maybe 35 different stands that we've worked in throughout the Wisconsin. I'm going to focus my comments on Wisconsin, but I've been working in the UP as well. And most of my data that I'm going to show you in the next few slides come from a subset of that data, which are paired half-hectare plots. So in these half-hectare plots, we stem mapped every stem, we cut every remnant piece of wood, stump, log, snag, and tried to grow those forests backwards in time to the best of our ability. And so this is one example from many different plots that we could, I could talk about, but this is the Togatik River up in the Northwest Sands. And this is what we see. We see relatively frequent fire, 7 years in this case, depending on how you filter these, you could range from 7 to 10 years, but really frequent fires. So that I think we've established already this morning. What I think is more interesting is the recruitment that's shown on the bottom of that fire history diagram on the right. And so those are ages, those are born on dates essentially of trees that we grew backwards. And if you had to try to put a cohort label onto these things, it would be hard to do so. There's at least 6 cohorts. I would say it's probably more like continual recruitment. It's hard to define a cohort that grew over, say, 40 years, right? So basically, we had continual regeneration at a low level. We had continual mortality coming from fire. So this is painting a different picture than the way we think about pine systems. And again, this is not limited to the outwash stands. Over 35 stands we've been in, we have never seen an example of an even-aged red pine dominated stand. I don't know that it occurs. And so it shouldn't really come as any surprise to us. And these are those half-hectare plots again, where we looked at tree density. So we grew the trees backward in time we used 1860 as our quote unquote historical reference point, and then current. So, our stands are way more dense than they were historically. And again, we're talking primarily about forests. The map on the right is based on general land office notes, witness trees, and density derived from those. We know we had a lot of open forest, open woodland, open savanna, but what I'm primarily talking about is forests. There are a couple exceptions in 1860, and one of them is Frog Lake. Has a very high basal area, lots of big diameter white and red pine today. That was one of the rare exceptions, I think, that where you actually had severe fire. And the GLO notes, the observer comments sort of corroborate that finding. So we feel pretty good about this data. I think this is a really interesting piece. So I mentioned that we stem mapped in those half-hectare plots. So we really wanted to get an idea of spatial patterning. And I think this is another line of evidence that tells us about mechanisms that shaped these forests. So if basically you had punctuated mortality followed by recruitment, and you had climate and competition, which are the primary forces that foresters and managers tend to think about for good reasons. If we had those shaping these stands over time, you'd expect to see what we found in the current forest, which is that the trees were completely spatially random. There was no spatial pattern. And that is basically shown there. The confidence interval is the gray area of those lines, and it's a spatial analysis. So we found that basically for all of these stands, these natural origin red pine stands, they're completely spatially random. But when we map the stumps and the older trees, and in some cases there were old growth stands that we worked in, they were never completely spatially random. They were always had a clumpy, groupy pattern. And so why that's important is it tells us, again, about that mortality pattern and the recruitment pattern. So it wasn't climate and competition that were really driving these stands. It was a low level of mortality that probably acted in a very heterogeneous fashion and added this clumpy, groupy spatial pattern to these forests over time. So it's really quite different than the way we think about red pine. And so this is a compilation of fire history data from those sites. So each one of these lines has been filtered for the most widespread fires in a site. And then the dates along the bottom in the composite are dates that occur in multiple ecological landscapes. So we have a pretty good sense that these are widespread fire events, the composite along the bottom. So they're filtered and then filtered again is one way to think about that. And we know something about some of these dates. I've highlighted a few here. And so, these are, some of these fire years we have some information about. I think if I paused long enough and gave people a chance to look at these, I hope that you would recognize at least one of them, especially on the 150th anniversary of the Peshtigo fire coming up, which was in 1871. Starting in 1780, Mike and others put together a really neat little paper on that particular fire year. And it was what they uncovered, the Dark Day of New England. So this was a fire event in the Ontario and the Lake states that set the stage for kind of a strange occurrence on the East Coast. And so the weather patterns were such that the smoke hadn't billowed in yet, but the sun was blackened out from all the fires. And so people were really starting to enter a state of panic. They didn't know what was going on. Chickens were going to roost in midday. So this happened to be a spring fire, a May fire. And so this was a pretty big fire event. And there's some evidence of it occurring in fire scars all through the Appalachia and around, the eastern United States. So a big by all means a big fire event. Now this one I've already kind of given you I've stolen my own thunder here, but 1871 should be familiar to most people on this call. That was the year in Wisconsin of the Peshtigo fire. I actually wonder how people in Michigan talk about this, because you had twice as many acres burned there as we did. But we tend to name fires where suppression efforts are, or resources or lives are lost. But ecologists don't tend to think of fires like that. We tend to think about them in terms of fire years. So 1871 is a fire year, not a fire event. But what's interesting about this to me is that we tend to lump all of these years as sort of anomalies. And the Peshtigo fire would be a good example of that. It was the time of European settlement. There was pine slash in the woods. It was dry. There was all this ignition. And you had these severe fires. So by all means, I think people would basically consider these to be uncharacteristic fires. So 1871 killed a lot of people in Wisconsin. 1881 was a big fire year in Michigan and Wisconsin. 1894 was the Hinckley fire in Minnesota, the most destructive fire in Minnesota's history, killed lots of people. It actually burned up two cities in Wisconsin and killed a couple hundred people here too. 1910 was a big one. So you get the picture. But what really was interesting to me is having visited the Peshtigo Fire Museum and looking at some of the old maps. And so I have a picture here that many of you have probably seen that shows sort of the number dead, the high severity portion of the Peshtigo fire. But what struck me was the place names, the lower, middle, and upper Sugarbush. And anybody who knows this part of the world knows that it is indeed maple basswood beech forest. There is very little pine in the footprint of that Peshtigo fire. There wasn't then, and there still isn't today. So I got interested in that, and I took the geography of the high severity portion of the Peshtigo fire that I just showed you, and I overlaid it on the General Land Office witness trees and line trees. So any tree that the surveyors at the time of European settlement marked, I pulled out. And of course, the data bears just what I said. This is very low country. It's relatively productive. It is not piney. There's actually more black ash in this landscape than there is red or jack pine. So anyways, we are talking about, the narrative that this was an anomaly, that it was burning pine slash. And in 1871, we were still getting the easy to get pine. We weren't looking for, small pockets of pine on Door Peninsula. So there wasn't really pine slash in this landscape. There certainly was settlement. There certainly was major land use changes that would have, driven fire at the time. But I'm not convinced the simple narrative we've been telling ourselves is really all that accurate or useful. And if you expand the picture a little more, what we know from Green Island Lighthouse, which is out in the Door Peninsula, the bay, that lighthouse recorded smoke for 6 weeks prior to the October 7 or 8 blow up of the Peshtigo fire. So basically those forests were burning for at least a month prior to that event. And if we actually look at the footprint of the larger fires of that year, we see what we might expect. We see the low severity fire, the non-newsworthy fires were burning in what now is Marinette, Oconto, Menominee counties. That is essentially where our pineries are. So essentially the narrative we told ourselves about pine slash doesn't really apply. In fact, it's the non-noteworthy fires that burned through that type of setup. And so if we look at the actual area burned just in Wisconsin, from this map alone, we're talking 3 million acres plus another 3 million acres in Michigan. We're talking at least a 6 million acre fire year just in Michigan and Wisconsin. So a big one. And so that, I think, corroborates our finding that we do find 1871 in the tree ring records, and it was found in multiple ecological landscapes, dry year, etc. And this is a really outdated map that Colleen, who will be presenting after me, put together early on. So we've added some of these dates to other locations, and we could add a lot more dates to the map. but essentially it shows that a lot of, that we had fire years that were very, very extensive. 1910 popped out in the fire history diagram that I showed you. 1910, I've now found in southern Wisconsin in multiple places and in central Wisconsin. So that very well could have been one of our largest fire years in the last several hundred to 500 years, perhaps, in terms of scale, but we don't even talk about it. There have been half a dozen books written about 1910 in the Northern Rockies, but we barely pay attention to it. It would be lumped into these anomalous fire years. And so I got interested in scale of fires and tried to evaluate this a bit more systematically. Now, fire rotation is a little bit different than a mean fire return interval. Fire rotation is the time required to burn an area equal to the size of the area of interest. So some parts of your landscape, so this is broken down by ecological landscape in Wisconsin, some portions of the Northwest Sands would burn 5 times and others not at all, but until you basically have covered enough territory to burn the whole area. And so what we see, based on these synchronous fire years in these landscapes, were that we had on an average year, 500,000 acres could have burned per year. And we also know that average years probably make up very little of the area burned. Most fire area occurs in relatively few fire years, dry years with wind, et cetera, like 1871 or 1910. So in those years, we've determined, and we didn't try to calculate an area for that, there were 25 what we called regionally significant fire years over a 200+ year period. So by regionally significant now, we're talking about 1910, 1791, 1894, these big fire years. And I think by regionally significant, if we used Peshtigo as an example, that covered 6 million acres in these 2 states. We're talking millions of acres were burning in these regionally significant years. Furthermore, what's really interesting is that we've done these same calculations of fire rotation for these same landscapes using the General Land Office notes. And the General Land Office notes can really only detect high severity fire. And they determined it took hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 years to burn these landscapes with high severity fire. And we're finding it takes, between 17 and 35 years to burn the landscape. So orders of magnitude different. So I think the conclusion is that high severity fires were rather unusual. They burned, even the Peshtigo might be an example of that, right? But we had low severity fires that were ubiquitous, and they were common, and they were widespread. And so this is kind of, and I just wanted to, in reading some of the questions that are coming from this group, and maybe responding to those a little bit, and also maybe planting the seeds for further discussion or further questions. I think this is interesting to me, right? Are our categories useful to us? And so this example, what I'm showing you here is a map of put together by Bud Heinzelman, who did really extensive fire history work early on in the Boundary Waters wilderness area. And if you look at that map, and I've highlighted some of the sort of fire and stand initiation dates, you see some familiar dates, hopefully. 1894, right? That was the Hinckley, Minnesota fire year that burned in Wisconsin as well, 1910. So you'll notice common fire dates, but the other part of this I think is interesting is most of those dates are actually what we refer to as European settlement era fires. And so in the Boundary Waters with the wilderness with a capital W, these dates are used to define the fire regime. Outside of the wilderness with a capital W, it's simply anomalous Euro settlement era fires. So I ask, is that a useful categorization of these things, wilderness versus non-wilderness? And I think we could carry down that logic too, in terms of lightning versus native ignition. So by lightning and native, are we referring to natural and human ignition? And I think that probably, I mean, these kinds of questions are interesting to us fire ecologists who get to nerd out on this sort of thing. But I think generally we had fire, and for whatever reason, we had lots of it, and we need fire now. And that's the big picture. The details are interesting, but maybe they're unimportant. And in cases, they might even be counterproductive. I think pyrophilic, which is a fire-loving versus fire-hating species, is a good example of that. I would bet that half of our hemlock in this region owed their existence, their origin to fire in one way, shape, or form. So yes, it's a fire-hating species. It's not a fire-resistant species, but it may be in some cases fire-dependent. And the Colleen, who will be up after me, will give you, in the landscape she's been working in, the tree species are tamarack and white cedar. Those are probably somewhere in between fire-hating and fire-loving, but they are fire-dependent species. So I think maybe those categories are a little bit too black and white. And then, there's pre-European settlement and post-settlement data. And wrapping up, I'll say, there's been a lot of interest in these historical data sets, and we've done some cool things with them, including going back to John Curtis's sites throughout Wisconsin and resurveying them to note changes in the landscape. Curtis knew that a lot of these fire-dependent landscapes were just that, but he also struggled with this period of European settlement. Fires were sort of the last desecration of already desecrated landscapes. So it was hard to figure out what's good and what's bad, what's quote natural and what's not. But so one of our sites actually in the southern part of the Central Sands is one of Curtis's sites. And so, I've just basically pulled out that period of cutover and slash fires, and then I put it into the context of another couple hundred years of fire history. And it's pretty hard to make those same statements or sentiments if you look at that period of time in a larger context. I don't think there was anything anomalous in terms of frequency of fire. I don't think there was anything anomalous in terms of scale of fires, and maybe severity, that's debatable. But anyways, fire is actually any kind of fire, it is the important thing. That's the if you want to use a poor term, natural thing. These are fire dependent landscapes and they need fire. So our reference data is relative. Fire was important, and I think sometimes these categorical way of understanding maybe is slowing our knowledge down rather than helping it. And so I'll end with a quote from Leopold, right? So here's Aldo Leopold with some of his students in the 1930s burning at the UW Arboretum, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. And he says, we're dealing right now with a fraction of a cycle involving centuries. We can't obstruct or reverse it, but we can bend it. What degree remains to be shown. And I think there's probably no way we're going to be burning 1 million acres per year, and nor do we need to necessarily. But I think there is a role for fire, and we're going to have to start to figure that out if we want to maintain our fire dependent communities, including some that we traditionally haven't really thought much about, like pine forests. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks. We had a couple little questions at the end here that popped up in the chat. Just a comment that distinction about hemlock being fire dependent is brilliant, something new that we haven't heard before. So are there any other species you think are like that? Things that we typically think of as non-fire associated species that really might be?
Yeah, well, I think white cedar is a fire dependent species. I think it was probably a stand replacing fire event more often than not. I think so, and we see fire scars. I was up in the Ottawa National Forest recently working, and there were, we're reconstructing fire history through these old red pine stumps with many fire scars on them, and immediately adjacent to those stumps were contemporary growing with those trees when they were trees. Hemlock with fire scars, white cedar with fire scars. Half of Bud Heinzelman's species that he reconstructed fire history from the Boundary Waters with were white cedar. So they can scar, they can live through fire. But so, you know, I'm definitely, I'm stretching a little bit here, and it's a little bit of a vulnerable position. There's a lot of work we need to do. But I think of even species that we know are fire dependent that we sort of forget, like paper birch. In Wisconsin, we're starting to worry about regenerating paper birch. That is a very fire dependent species. So if you know, I mean, and there are lots of others too. There's some really interesting work out of Michigan actually in the 50s, looking at there was experimentally they did, I don't know where they got the audacity to do it, but they ran fire through yellow birch and got amazing regeneration of yellow birch. So yellow birch, I wouldn't try to argue as a fire dependent species, but all of these species had to coexist with fire somehow because these are fire landscapes. When you have 10 million acres burning, the fire is not discriminating. Okay, this is a red pine stand, we're going to burn it here, right? And of course, fire is heterogeneous, but fire was ubiquitous. That's pretty much what I've come to appreciate.
Yeah, good points. There's a lot of good discussion going on in the chat there too. So, yeah, I think a lot of species that were in the presence of fire, even if individuals could be killed by fire, they still might have been fire dependent species, and depending on fire being on the landscape in the long term. So I think it's time we kind of wrap up, and we'll probably bring up this topic again in the panel discussion. But next up, I guess we'll need to stop sharing your screen here. And next up will be Colleen Sutheimer. So Colleen is a graduate research assistant in the Silvis Lab in Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'll let Colleen bring up her presentation here. I'll let her introduce her talk. Go for it.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, I'm Colleen Sutheimer. I am in the Silvis Lab, but I also work really closely with Jed, doing fire history mostly in the UP for the last couple of years since 2017. Yeah, so for today I'm going to be talking about peatland fire and what we're finding in the UP and Wisconsin, and maybe kind of following up on what Jed was saying, rethinking how frequent fire is in these landscapes. So this is a rhetorical question, but if you think about recent fire history, especially in the Great Lakes region, the last kind of biggest wildfires that happened in our region were the Seney fire in 1976, you know, the Sleeper Lake fire in 2007, and then the Duck Lake fire in 2012. And the thing that kind of connects these all is they all started in peatlands. They were lightning strikes, and you know, they were some of the largest burning acreage. You're talking about tens of thousands of acres burned. So when we're thinking about peatland fire, we kind of have this convention of, you know, peatlands only burn under severe droughts. When they do start burning, you know, it's severe conditions. The fire is severe, the drought is severe, and then there's prolonged burning, you know, burning potentially into organic soil and, you know, consumption of peat soils. So this is kind of what we think about when we think about peatland fire generally and in our region. But then when we get on the landscape, which is kind of how this project started in the Hiawatha National Forest, going to some fens and bogs and thinking about why we're seeing evidence of fire like this. So this is an island in the middle of a peatland. There's not really any topography. It like rises barely off of the peatland substrate. And you see these red pine trees and they all have fire scars, which is interesting in itself, but what is also interesting is that the orientation of these faces, the cat faces like Mike was talking about, are all 360 degrees around this island, which is pretty indicative that the fire probably came and originated in the peatland and burned through these uplands. So when you see things like this, you got to think, obviously this fire wasn't burnt severe enough to burn these trees down, it scarred them. And so what's really going on? Are these peatland fire and conventions that we have about peatland fire really as accurate as we think? So in our region, the Great Lakes region, we kind of have these ideas, you know, you can see in this graph on the left, you see the tension zone and, you know, higher severity fire, more frequent fire to the south, and then less frequent fire north of the tension zone. And you kind of think, so below the tension zone, you're talking fire return intervals of like 1 to 50 years, and above 50 to over 1,000 years. So that's kind of the way we think about fire in the Great Lakes. Prairie systems depended on it. Forests maybe not so much, but as Mike and Jed pointed out, it's a lot more frequent. So you have this kind of landscape level fire regime, and then what happens when you zoom into stand levels, you kind of get the same mixed messaging. So on the left, I actually have one of the sites we sampled at. These black dots are each tree sample we got. And then it's kind of divided into the peatland area, which, the fire return interval for that area is anyway from 200 to over 1,000 years. And right adjacent to it, you have red and jack pine. And to the south of this site, there's white pine and hemlock. But right adjacent to this 200 to 1,000 year interval is, 0 to 50 year intervals. So kind of the question comes, is fire really following these intervals that we're thinking about? And is it really dominated by the vegetation, and that's primarily what drives it? Or, as Jed suggested, is fire more of a ubiquitous kind of disturbance that's burning throughout these entire systems? So those are kind of the questions we started thinking about. And the reason why we chose the Great Lakes and peatlands in the Great Lakes specifically was because compared to the boreal zone, so this little inset here on the right is, North America. This darker green is, the boreal forest. This lighter teal is what they refer to as the hemiboreal. And the distinction here is that the hemiboreal just has more mixed landscapes. There's more heterogeneity in the landscapes. So you can have dry to dry mesic forest right adjacent to peatland. Whereas, in the boreal forest, you have a lot more coniferous species, larger peatlands that don't really have mixing. And so when you're thinking about fire, you got to really think about, the vegetation on the landscape and how it's mixed and how it's heterogeneous and how fire can either be promoted or kind of blocked in these systems. So the larger graph is just the 3 peatland sites that we sampled. These are all primarily northern poor fens embedded into dry and mesic forests, mostly dominated by jack and red pine, but also populus and white pine and hemlock and cedar in some cases too. So kind of the objectives for my master's in this project we're working on with the Forest Service and Wisconsin DNR was to really look at low and moderate severity fire and fire that we'd expect to be more frequent than what was traditionally thought of in peatlands. And we did that by using tree ring approach. And so basically the tree rings will let us understand the drivers of historical peatland fire regimes. And then kind of the last part of our project is kind of combining some of the techniques that David talked about. So lake sediment and peat sediment. And so we're looking at a longer temporal scale, and we're really seeing if fire regimes in the last couple hundred years that we get from the tree record are representative of what we might find for 1,000 years in these lake sediments. And ultimately our goal is just to characterize, peatland fire regimes in the Great Lakes. We don't know a lot about it. We don't know a lot about fire history in the Great Lakes outside of, red pine, which we've in the few recent years have really hit hard. So we're trying to look at different ecosystems and how fire moves through them. And then obviously, ultimately, we want to give this information to the people that are making the decisions on the ground. So yeah, just to briefly recap why we use fire scars and tree rings. Like Mike said, they're really good. You can identify individual fires, and you can even get down into season. They're really good at capturing low and moderate severity fires. So, severe fire will probably consume the record of the tree record. So they're more recording these less severe fires. And, in the Great Lakes, our record can go back, like Mike said, probably 500 years. Out west, if you're talking about bristlecone pine, you can get to thousands of years with the tree ring history. And these pictures are just some samples that we took. So this one is a cut stump, and you can see the fire scars. And then we cross-date them, figure out the year and season. And then this is actually a red pine that has a cat face that's right adjacent to a peatland lake. So the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about our analyses from our tree ring work across our 3 sites. So we sampled, like I said, 3 sites: Hay Meadow Flowage, Ramsey Lake and Bachelor Lake, Hay Meadows in the Schwalm and Nicolay, and then Ramsey and Bachelor are actually in the Hiawatha National Forest in the UP. And so our sampling design, obviously, if you're sampling trees to get fire history for peatland, you got to be a little decisive about it. And so we really tried to approach it by looking at the fire regimes for the uplands surrounding based on land fire, and then the peatlands. And we tried to get a good sampling. So we were surrounding the peatland with fire history. And then we were selecting also sites that either had ridges through the peatland, like at Ramsey Lake, or had these forested islands that were completely surrounded by peatlands. So basically, we just want to make sure that, you know, when we're saying a fire burned on these uplands and burned in this island, it burns through the peatland vegetation. And that really allows us to say something about this entire landscape, instead of just saying we sampled these uplands, they burned a lot, but we can't say that it burned in the peatland. So that's kind of our approach. Our study design is just separate, distinct landforms that for fires to occur on both landforms, it had to burn through peatland vegetation. You know, our areas ranged from 82 to over 1,200 hectares. And then kind of our time spans were from the mid 1500s to, you know, present day, when we were able to select living trees. So immediately what you can see in this chart is that our fire return intervals are a lot less than, you know, the projected 200 to over 1,000 years that land fire might say in these peatlands. So these intervals are for the entire landscape, meaning that these peatlands burned on average every 7 to 34 years, which is pretty incredible, considering if you think about Mike's pointing out that, you know, the Guyette kind of fire history for the UPs kind of fits right in this range. So here's a system, a peatland system, that you would think would not burn as regularly as the surrounding landscape, but in fact did. So I, just like everyone else, I got some cool fire history graphs just to reorient you. The horizontal lines are each a different tree sample, and then the vertical lines are each a fire event. So to figure out those fire return intervals, what we did was we looked for fires that scarred both either around the peatland or within the peatland, and then we compared those, and that kind of gave us these widespread synchronous fire years, which if you think back to Jed's talk, you can see some of those years that he mentioned. So these were definitely burning with the surrounding landscapes, and they were burning as frequent as the surrounding landscapes, which is really important when we think about how we should be using fire in these systems, or what fire has done in these systems. And just to point out too, after the mid 1900s, you can see the fire suppression era, where fire basically stops at all our sites. So, you know, when we think about peatland fire, we automatically think, well, they only burn when it's incredibly dry, when it's severe drought. And what we found by comparing all the fire scars across our sites was that these fires really didn't occur when it was severe drought. Sure, there were dry conditions, but it wasn't severe drought. And I think this ties into what David was talking about, that, you know, these seasonal instances of drying, like late summer, are really important for fire, and really important for fire in peatlands, especially where, you know, you could get a late summer drought, it dries out the surface vegetation on the peatland, but, you know, those peat soils are still inundated. So if a fire did rip through there, it'd burn on the surface and not into the peat, where, you know, it could do major destruction. So we also can look at seasonality of fires in peatlands. The diagram that Mike had was a lot better than the one I have, but so we basically look at the position of the scar in the tree ring, and we can determine when the fire burned. And for our scars, we found out that peatland fires mostly occurred in the Dorman and Latewood, which corresponds really to late summer and early spring. You know, this could be, like I said, seasonal drying in the late summer, dries out. These moderate and low severity fires can burn through the peatland vegetation, but not burn up the peat, or in spring when you get snow melt and, you know, there's the water table is high in the soil, but the surface fuels are drying up. So this actually makes a lot of sense if you think about fire, low severity fire in peatlands, and it supports that. You know, the precise timing of seasonality it can be a little bit of a guesswork. We don't have really good information about when, you know, red pine, when trees start putting on late wood in the Great Lakes, and, you know, when early wood starts. So this can be a little hard to decipher, but mostly we can be pretty confident that these fires were in late summer to early spring, either when the tree was starting to put on late wood or right before it started growing in the spring. So the other portion of our project is taking more of the approach that Dave kind of talked about, and that's using charcoal and lake and peat sediments. And the kind of idea behind this is it extends our record significantly. You're talking about over thousands of years of potential fire history you can get. Like David said, it's not as precise dating as tree history. You can't get that yearly and seasonal resolution. So you have to use proxies kind of to figure out when fires are occurring. It's really important, at least in our sediments, that we are not able to identify single fire events. We don't have the kind of sedimentation rates that allow that fine resolution. So really what we're looking at is fire periods. And then the last kind of point is we can look at kind of the shapes and types of charcoal, and that tells us something about the fuels that were burning during these fire periods. So we got lake and peat sediment. Well, our collaborators at MTU got the peat sediments, and then we got lake sediments. And kind of the idea behind our sampling design here was to core lakes and peat that overlapped with our fires from our tree history. So kind of the white dots are all our tree samples. These yellowish dots are the lake sediment core samples we got, and these kind of teal dots are the peat sediment cores that our collaborators at MTU got. And basically we did this just so that, you know, we're comparing apples to apples. The spatial area that we're looking at these sediments are the spatial areas that our tree record covers. And that just makes it more comparable. So we were fortunate enough to get some funding from the Joint Fire Science Program and the Lake States Fire Science Consortium to do some charcoal work on our lake sediments. And a lot of this work is actually done by our undergraduate assistant, Cassie Kaplan. And so we've just started putting this together. I just sent out the samples for radiocarbon dating last week. So we don't quite have the dates yet, but we have counted the charcoal, so we can try to start looking at these frequent fire periods. So here on the left, I've just put a total charcoal. So basically, like David said, you take a core, you subsection it. We subsection every ½ centimeter. You sieve the soil to get the charcoal out, and then you count the charcoal, which is a very laborious process. But what we get from that is these kind of abundance of charcoals. So here I've highlighted the 2 peaks that we have. The top depth of the core, which would be most recent in time. There's one kind of around 4 to 6 centimeters. And then we have another peak in charcoal at around 42 to 46 centimeters. And this kind of peaks above this normal noise you see indicates that these are probably related to fire. So like David said, there's always going to be charcoal washing into the basin. But when it's these large peaks, we can be pretty confident that there's a fire, multiple fire events causing that. And so once we count the charcoal, we can also look at the shape of it. And here I've separated it into the most common shapes we found. And on the bottom is the percentage of the total count that was this shape. So our 2 top counts were frothy and grass at this kind of earlier, more recent peak, and then mostly frothy at the second peak. So what we do with those types is we can then determine what was burning. So basically what we do is we take a bunch of stuff, pine needles, grass, we burn it in the lab, and then we produce charcoal from it. And then we produce those structures that we find to what we see in our sediments. And we can kind of determine what was burning then during our frequent periods. So for the work we've done at Betchville Lake so far, we found out that fine fuels were burning during frequent periods. And why this is interesting is because if you think of a peatland fire and you think it's only severe, you would expect to have a larger kind of percentage of maybe this fibrous, where you actually have pine wood that's showing up. But mostly what we were finding is charcoal that was probably from grass, or, you know, fine fuels in the understory, and pine needles and twigs. So it's really supportive that these fires were probably low to moderate severity fires. And, you know, that's intriguing because it also can tell us a little bit about the landscape. Like Jed was saying, you know, how we define forest, in a closed canopy forest historically could have actually had a lot of fine fuels on the ground, which would have supported, you know, these low to moderate severity fires, which then burned into the peatlands. So kind of to recap, the conventional thinking of peatland fire, you know, fires only burn every 100 to 1,000 years. They only occur when you have severe or sustained drought. There's the thinking that, you know, they burn from the uplands into the peatlands. And from our work, what we really found was, you know, fires burned every 10 years. These low to moderate severity fires are pretty representative of the surrounding landscape fire regimes, and they burn through the peatlands too. They burned under dry conditions, but not necessarily drought. And I think that that's related to that seasonal drying, where, you know, your surface fuels are drying up, but the peat's still inundated, so it's not burning into the peat and destroying it. And then they were widespread across the uplands and peatlands. And we even found, you know, evidence that fires started in the peatlands and burned into the uplands. So why is this important? I think right now we're kind of on the precipice of wondering how climate change might impact peatlands, and peatlands really are some of our last remaining holdouts of, you know, untampered with systems, at least in the Great Lakes. And so if we removed a part of their ecology, an important part, we could be tampering with their resilience. And so, you know, you get into thinking like, if we don't burn these, could woody vegetation encroach, suck up the water from the peat soils? So when we do get these bigger droughts and drying, you now have, you know, a bunch of fuel on the surface. The peat has lost water because the vegetation on the surface is sucking it up. You get a fire in there and it's going to burn into the peatland. So we just need to rethink how we kind of have conventions and what the conventions are. And I think this research has really shown that maybe what we thought is the standard is not quite what was really going on. Like Mike said, no project is really complete without acknowledging all the folks that help with it. And we've just been really lucky to be a part of a pretty awesome collaboration team. And just everyone from helping us get out to lakes in the middle of February on snowmobiles to coming out and seeing how we sample. Just really appreciate all help we've got. So with that, I think I'm done.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Colleen. So there was one question in the chat a little bit earlier. We'll get the next one here too. Would you recommend burning peatlands in the modern day when it's not really drought conditions, so that burns don't compromise carbon storage or burn deeper in the peat?
Yeah, I'm by no means a manager or have any kind of ways to claim to be, but I definitely think, you know, just to prevent headaches and having to get equipment into the middle of the peatland, if you do start the peat on fire, yeah, it would be better to burn it under moderate conditions. But the thing too that we find from historical regimes is that these fires were low to moderate severity fire anyway. Like, it's not going to burn through all the vegetation. You don't want it to burn through all the vegetation. The main thing is, you know, the water table has to be high enough. It's not going to get in those peat, but, you know, the sphagnum or sedge is dry enough that it's crispy enough to carry it across.
Yeah, so it could be both a kind of a year-to-year variation in drought conditions, but also a seasonality thing too, whether the fires in spring or late summer, like you were saying, versus a summer fire.
Yeah, because it could be really tricky. Like if your prescribed burn window is the spring, you know, you get a dump of snow or a dump of rain and you're out of prescription, right? It's not going to carry through those surface vegetation.
Right. And another question in there, asking if were these sedge dominated open fens or did they have woody vegetation?
Yeah, so mostly in the center, like Betcher Lake was sedge dominated and it was really open. Our hay meadow was also, but around the kind of periphery or near the uplands, there was a lot of encroachment. So a lot of black spruce moving in and bog birch. So more woody around the surrounding, but in the middle of these fens, it was mostly sedge, sphagnum too dominant.
Okay, cool. Another question, you said building off the previous question I asked, what about burning bogs on the southern end of their distribution in the Great Lakes region? Any insights on how it would affect the plant community? So thinking like southern Michigan bogs versus more northern.
Yeah, I don't really know much about southern Michigan bogs, but what I think about, I guess, is there hasn't been a lot of research in our region about the impacts of fires on peatlands. You know, you get into the boreal zone in Canada, and they've done a lot of work on looking at wildfires' influence on vegetation communities. And so I can speak a little to that from the kind of papers I've read. So they found that, you know, it's always heterogeneous and there's always refugia, like during most of the burns, even the most severe burns, they found refugia. So you'll have patches of sphagnum that are completely unburned right next to, you know, where it burned into the peat. So it's very variable. And I think the main thing is that heterogeneity is what is going to influence the plant community. So if you have a really severe fire that's ripping through there, it's probably going to destroy a lot of the species that are important to that community and are, you know, bog dependent, peatland dependent. But if you have this kind of variability where you have a range of severity and intensity of fire, I think it would create enough refugia that you could get, you know, maybe consumption of undesirables while also maintaining, you know, refugia for your pitcher plants and, you know, sundews and stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question just popped in. How might fire in peatlands help or hinder invasion by glossy buckthorn?
Yeah, so my kind of experience with buckthorn is not in peatlands, but I guess my main concern or thought there would be you got to be really careful about resprouting. I imagine in peat you could potentially be opening up more nutrients for buckthorn. So even if you killed it, top killed it, if there's still access for it to get nutrients, you could potentially the next year just have a crazy amount of new sprouts. So I think you'd have to be really careful about thinking how that might happen. And it would take some careful planning and monitoring, I think, before we know kind of what would respond.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme with buckthorn in general.
Yeah.
It takes a little finesse to figure that
Yeah.
species out sometimes and find the right mix. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat unless anybody else has anything. All right, I think we covered most of those. I guess we'll go ahead and move into our break. So our break time goes until 11:30, and we'll be back at 11:30 then. Thanks. Thanks, Colleen. All right, it's 11:30 Eastern time, 10:30 Central, 9:30 Mountain, 8:30 Pacific for those across the country. So we'll get started again. If we could have our panelists, I guess all four of you, David, Michael, and Jed and Colleen, if you could maybe turn your cameras on and everything. Yeah, I got some questions that are kind of probably pertain to all of you in some sense, but I'll let you kind of chime in as you wish. We'll try to keep this a fairly informal discussion, but I want to start out with, there was a question on there about climate change and that sort of thing, and just kind of phrase a little question for you. With changing climate conditions and predictions that are that we've seen to date, how does either the paleorecord or wetland record or tree ring record, any of those, guide us for the future of fire-dependent ecosystems in the Great Lakes region? How do you see things changing over the next, 50, 100 years versus what we saw in the past in the record?
Good question.
I'll say something first. So I mentioned in my talk that we developed a model called the PC2FM model, and that model incorporates precipitation and temperature to predict fire frequency, and it's calibrated by the tree ring record of fire scars. And many folks have found it to work well across the country. We've used that model in the South Central US and projected future changes in fire probability or fire frequency. And just recently, we submitted a paper that expanded that work to project future fire frequency across the whole United States. And so that's in review. And the model is suggesting business as usual conditions at the end of the 21st century is going to result in about doubling at most in fire frequency. So there's information coming. I won't let too much out of the bag, but all the models, no matter which one we run, suggest that fire frequency will be increasing by mid-century. In some areas, Jed, the northern sands in particular, are suggesting potentially a doubling.
Glenn, I'll take a shot at that too from maybe a little bit different perspective. So I work right at the interface of management and research, working for a state agency. We have a lot of that pine that I mentioned that's at rotation, or it's either planted in rows. There are various pests, pathogens, problems. We're not regenerating it. And it seems to me like we're moving away from planting it. And part of the justification, I think, is that it's projected to be a climate change loser, red pine. Meanwhile, you have experiments, say in the cutfoot forest in Minnesota, where they're planting 3 different subspecies of ponderosa pine because it's drought and fire tolerant species. I think it stems from our lack of understanding of red pine. It's definitely going to be a loser regardless of climate change if we can't figure out how to give it fire because it's a fire dependent species. We're not going to regenerate it at any scale without some burning, which it hasn't had in 100 to 150 years. So I always say to our foresters that climate change, or climate, I should say, is the envelope of what's possible. Disturbance is what really drives what actually happens on the ground. And to just put that into another perspective, we celebrate Whitaker's classic biome figure that's in all ecology textbooks, where he ordinated biomes based on temperature and precipitation. This whole region where we're sitting right now is what he called ecosystems uncertain, meaning it is not driven by precip or temperature. It falls in this gray area where almost every foot of land could either be a grassland, a savanna, a woodland, a forest of many different kinds. So it's really disturbance. And I'm not a climate change denier or skeptic, but I do see that we're racing towards the end of the 21st century, and we haven't begun managing for the beginning of the 20th or 19th centuries.
Yeah, interesting perspective. Yeah. Move on another topic. Something we heard about yesterday a little bit is the difference between prescribed fire and wildfire, and how there's kind of the science and the study of those two can vary a bit. And there's some differences between how prescribed fires apply to the landscape versus wildfire. I think this kind of gets at some of the questions that are popping up in the chat now too. But so we know that prescribed fires differ from kind of the historic wildfire regimes in changes in variability of or heterogeneity in terms of size or intensity or severity of fire, or the season of fire can be different with prescribed fire versus wildfire, at least in the way it's applied now. So to help restore or maintain lake states fire-dependent ecosystems, like some of the pine forests or the peatlands or some of the ones we've talked about, based on the historical information, how much should we be burning, from a prescribed fire standpoint, acres in size, what frequency, seasons, any of those sorts of variables, combinations of intensity, severity on the landscape. So kind of looking at prescribed fire with what we could apply to the landscape today versus in a management context, safely versus some of the historic fire in the landscape. You see any differences or ways to look at that kind of? Any ideas?
That one would be hard for somebody like me to address, but I just to circle back to the prior question. I mean, one of the things that we seem to see is during about where we're headed in the future. I mean, we know climate's warming. I think one of the projections in the Midwest is mostly that it may become wetter, may become drier, but certainly variability is going to increase. A decent analog, this is why there's been so much focus in the last couple thousand years, is the medieval climate anomaly. It was a little bit warmer, more than likely, and it was droughty, and we had this plenty of fires burning. So in terms of a lesson from the paleorecord in terms of where we're headed could be for more fire in the future for sure. But in terms of prescribed fire versus natural fire, that's beyond me. Somebody else is going to have to take that one.
Yeah, I thought that might be a tough one for the crowd, but it was a common question that was popping up in our pre-conference questions.
One thing I would add in terms of the seasonality piece, I mean, what we're seeing right now is wetter winters and springs, and that's been that was projected or predicted. We're also predicted to get drier summers and falls potentially. Right now, we're actually in a wetting period. So seasonality fits into that. We need to be looking at other seasons for burning, certainly, for prescribed fire. And I think there's also a colleague of mine has done a lot with groundwater in the central sands, in particular, Wisconsin. And, we, in some of these sort of oscillations in climate, this variability that Dave talked about, we'll see 20-foot rising and lowering of the water table of groundwater. And in the central sands, that groundwater is really close to the surface. So anyways, we need to be burning when we can, and that might be shifting. And managers tend to look at, April. We have 4 weeks to get it done, plus or minus a couple weeks. But that window could be shifting or closing.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, and it brings me back to some of the peatland discussions too. With if we had the more low intensity, kind of more frequent surface fires across those peatlands in the spring, that time of year, if where our springs are getting wetter, maybe we'll have less of that happening and more of the deeper burning, more intense peatland fires. So maybe that whole fire regime would change going forward. So you nodding, Colleen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that hits it on the head. I think one of the major concerns, at least in the boreal, where we're already seeing these massive peatland fires that are, destroying entire thousands of hectares of peatlands, is that you kind of get the peatlands drying out. And if you have surface fuel buildup on top of them, because maybe there wasn't low to moderate severity fire, and obviously the boreal is different than our region, but yeah, so you got all the surface fuel, it's getting drier. The water is not recharged. So if we're getting less snow or the snowpack's smaller in the winter, you're not getting that recharge to the water levels. you're just making it dry out and making it more likely that you're going to get those deep burning peat fires, which is what we're really concerned about, I guess, with peatlands. And thinking of a climate change, like you're putting that carbon into the air and you're not going to return that carbon to the soil. It took thousands of years to store it in the peat. So you're immediately releasing that, and it's just adding more carbon and kind of creating that positive feedback loop.
Yeah, any other thoughts on that? All right, another thing that came up a little bit earlier, I think it was during Mike's talk actually, kind of what level of detection do we see in the tree ring data for the really low intensity fires, like the super low intensity ones that just kind of skip across the landscape? And are those really detected at all in the tree ring data, or are they really, are we missing some of those really low intensity ones? It sounds like the tree ring is probably capturing kind of that middle range where, you know, the super high intensity stuff where the whole tree's gone, you're going to miss those, but maybe we miss those really low end ones too.
Yeah, I wish I would have talked about that when I talked, but I missed a lot of things. You know, it really depends. So, you know, when fuels change, you can go from a fire regime that's driven by, you know, flashy herbaceous fuels, which create a different scarring dynamic than what we see in the last century when we've lost a lot of herbaceous fuels. We have a lot more woody fuels, and those are maybe slower moving, longer duration fires that actually we see having equal, if not higher, scarring rates on trees than some of the historical fires. I think it is probably true that if the tree ring record is missing much, it's probably missing the very low severity fires. But we are also probably somewhat missing the very high severity fires as well. We can get at some of that through you know, death dates, but those are hard to come by, especially when high severity fires consume so much evidence. But you know, just based on my experience, you know, we've worked on about 150 different fire histories across the U.S. Fire scars can be very good, very accurate. We can record annual burning with fire scars. In fact, we've recorded fires, more than one fire in a single year with fire scars. So they can record the high frequency fire in the right conditions. Now, certainly they can miss it too, but they do have the potential to do that. And then lastly, one thing I like to kind of point out is you can look at those fire history diagrams as scarring fires. And if you're using that for management, then if you're not scarring trees, then you're not putting a fire like was historically on the landscape. You're not actually producing those effects. Your effects are much likely more reduced if you're not scarring trees. So sure, the record may be missing some fires, but you know, if you're not scarring trees, then you're likely not even you know, producing an event that was in the historical record.
Yeah, interesting. What about for the kind of the paleo record, the sediment data? David, you think you're capturing mostly the really large fires, the more extreme events, or kind of that moderate range, or even the lighter ones?
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything because that's a tricky question, because with the lakes, you also have the issue of, well, how close to the lake did the fire burn, right? Was it right in the watershed, or is it blowing in from further away? I mean, typically, the size of charcoal we're looking at isn't dispersed, you know, that far. So it's, you know, probably fires that are burning fairly close, you know, within a kilometer of a lake, or even, you know, less than that. But I didn't get into details of methods. It's kind of difficult in the systems that burn pretty frequently to tease apart fire frequency and things like that. But if you move further west, where maybe the fire frequency is 100 years or something like that, you can actually fit curves to subtract out. Colleen mentioned the fact that you always have a little bit washing in, so you can subtract off that background and identify, peaks that you're pretty sure were fires within the watershed. So they're the fact that we're kind of subtracting off this background kind of would suggest, I think that, we're not looking at, low severity fires. We're looking at pretty good fires that are, consuming a lot of biomass within the watershed of the lake. I don't know if you had anything else to add, Colleen, but.
No, that sounds right on about, what charcoal peaks you're getting are not what we're looking at the tree rings.
Yeah, interesting. So you can kind of use the two different data sets together. Tree ring might miss the really extreme fires, and then but the paleorecord might capture those. So yeah, interesting. How, it's more of a general question here. I don't know who to best address it to, but how important do you think this was, the season of fire versus frequency and intensity, or severity of fire? You think season was really important? We captured that a little bit for the peatlands, but.
So I might be missing the question a little bit, but just to tackle the last thing I heard, which was seasonality. So there's some work in this region looking at hazel reduction in northern pine forests, and spring burning, multiple spring burns didn't do a thing to reduce hazel. In fact, the same year they were burned, it was as dense as it was before. This is Buckman's work. And whereas a couple of summer burns, growing season burns, were evident decades later, or still evident maybe in cases. So, and just thinking about, I mean, that's coming from the overstory into the understory, but so seasonality is potentially important for ways that we're not really even thinking about. You're not going to get red pine to regenerate under hazel, I don't think.
Yeah.
In fact, I think it can actually suppress growth of small red pine seedlings. It has some kind of a allelopathic effect on seedlings.
Interesting.
I'll just add to that. One thing that we've been talking about in the Midwest with fire seasonality, and also thinking about all biota, is that, depending on what part of the year you're talking about, things are either dormant or flowering or fawning, or what species are you talking about? And microbes may not ever be dormant, and so seasonality really has selective pressure against all biota, depending on where they are in their life cycle, and also with the conditions of the fire. So it's really a hard question to get at without very specific parameters, and also the scale of the fire is very important as well. So you may do something at a seasonal effect in one location, but if you're talking about wildlife, well, they can move off of that area and there's really no seasonal effect on them. So depending on what species you're talking about, the seasonality varies. The effects of seasonality can vary spatially as well.
It makes a lot of sense.
It's become a mess of a conversation as opposed to more solutions.
Yeah, shows the complexity of fire. So the timing, the intensity, the severity, it's not just fire on the landscape, it's what kind of fire and when, and what are your objectives and what are you trying to accomplish, what species, and even what are you trying to do with that species. So yeah. Switch topic here just a little bit. There were quite a few questions in the before this talk about kind of indigenous Native American culture and burning. So I'll throw a couple of those out there and see what you guys think. One was, does indigenous culture or knowledge or history come up often when you discuss fire history, either through questions or just through research? And are there any indigenous researchers part of any of your work? And if so, or if not, how do you coordinate your activities with some of the cultural resource management and tribal reviews?
Yeah, I can take a first shot at that. So yeah, I would say every time I present fire history, there's always questions about, native versus natural burning. So yeah, it definitely is always on our minds. And I think for my project, we are working with some folks in the Sioux tribe, specifically Eric Clark and Robin Clark, who are trying to incorporate some of the data we're finding with, traditional ecological knowledge from talking to elders and stuff. So yeah, there's definitely attempts at integration and working together. And I actually presented this research at the Cliffwick meeting a couple of weeks ago, or over a month ago now. So yeah, it's definitely sharing that information between the tribes and finding what overlap we have and stuff like that.
A similar question was in the chat earlier, and I took a shot at it there. Yeah, the question of, especially in the eastern part of the Prairie Peninsula, the question is always, well, are those natural fires or are those people setting the fires? And I don't think we really know. I mean, there is a little bit of archaeological evidence of people starting to, be moving around the landscape a little more when we see prairie expanding around 6,000 years ago. The one thing I'll just wanted to mention was there is an archaeologist at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey has been looking for sites around Chatsworth Bog and Nelson Lake, and apparently there's just not a great archaeological record from Chatsworth Bog, but there is from Nelson Lake, and so he's interested in doing more work at Nelson Lake to try to put the fire history within the context of the archaeological record that they see there. So I think that's more in the proposal stage. So that might be something we learn about, 5 or 10 years from now. But there is a lot of interest there and some work that's going to hopefully be started there.
I think we see a very strong human signal throughout the eastern United States in our fire histories. In many ways, I think our fire histories are human histories. The high frequency that we see in some ecosystems, there's just no way to sustain that through lightning ignitions. And I would say that this idea that humans were so dominant in fire regimes has been historically very unpopular and controversial, and is only starting to come around in some ecosystems as a potential major ignition source. That's not kind of the teaching that I had whenever I was being trained, and have just increasingly come to appreciate that is more and more evidence to be the case. I think we've done a fairly poor job at integrating Native people and traditional knowledge within our research. We've done some, but it hasn't been very good. In many ways, I think that we're still learning what the human signal is in some of these records, and whose was it. There, some people have been totally displaced from their lands that we are studying, and rarely is anyone still on those lands. And often our research is driven by kind of some very specific objectives that is a tangential kind of result, despite it maybe being increasingly important. And I think that it is very important because we are an intelligent ignition source, and likely those historical ignitions were for a very specific purpose, be it Native people or the fur traders that had probably a large impact on either more ignitions or less ignitions, or the early lumber industry. And I think it really now rests on us today as fire managers to determine what our objectives are as people and as ignition sources. And so there's a whole lot to be learned from historical cultures and you know, using fire to really survive and manage these ecosystems for very specific objectives, be it biodiversity or fire risk or whatever it might be.
I think just to throw in a alternative perspective, I tend to wonder why, like, that question of are our categories useful to us? I don't think it's, I mean, I think humans are a natural part of the system. I don't really think, if we're going to distinguish between humans today being not part of the system, then we're not going to have fire dependent systems. That was probably always the case. I think there was a period of time, a long period, where we underappreciated that, and probably in ways still do. That pendulum is switching with fire, I think. Whereas now, you know, we're going towards, like, everything was constructed and managed. The truth probably is somewhere in the muddled middle, if there is a truth. I think of, like, some of the logic behind, like, we couldn't have a sustained lightning ignited system. So, you know, it's because our lightning comes with rain, and it's wet and it's green and it's humid. Well, I've had prescribed burn project recently that looked at summer burning. And there are so many times when I'd be standing with a manager and they would look at their prairie and say, that cannot burn. And we would get a fantastic burn on it. We didn't have 20-foot flame lengths, but boy, did it move fire. So I'm constantly having to dispel these assumptions. So, you know, Colleen and I were sampling in a peatland in the Hiawatha a couple of years ago, and we were actually listening to our radio and phones because there was smoke billowing over us from a lightning fire in Seney. I don't know. I just think lightning is, I think there's lots of ignition, and lightning was part of it. To say that we wouldn't have a fire dependent systems without human construct is, I think, misguided. We have examples of grasslands that preceded humans by 2 million years. You just don't get that. So even, Mike, your work with Rich, like, you guys predicted fire regimes based on climate. How do you do that without, if you're attributing all fire to humans? I just think it's a little bit too far over in one direction. And a really good example is a barrier island off the coast of Florida that Henry Gracino Mayer and a student put together, a fire history there. It was a contemporary fire history. So it was, you know, post-European settlement. There was no habitation on the island. It was wet, it was humid, it was all growing season, lightning ignited fires, and it burned every 6 to 10 years on mark, never missed a fire. And in Wisconsin, we have 300,000 cloud to ground lightning strikes per year. I did my dissertation research in a very fire frequent part of the world, in the Southwest US, Mexico borderlands. The fire density is comparable to where I worked in the northern Mexico mountains of the Sierra Madre, and it was a lightning fire regime there. I guess to end, I just wonder what the utility is in needing to know this. We need fire. We've always had fire of one kind or another, and we're depending more now on human ignited fires. And we need to make the point, I think, that really that point, that we just need fire.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jed. You know, as humans, we still have our fires fit within the bounds of climate constraints. And there are, in my comments were mostly, you know, I should have couched them within the records of the last 400 years and also broadly across the Eastern United States. You know, we have a lot of records that are dominated by dormant season fires. And very frequent burning in the dormant season in, deciduous forests of Tennessee, and really hard to argue for, annual burning due to lightning in some of those areas. Not that I don't think it is impossible, and I think that here's a way it is possible, is that an ignition starts in Kansas and burns all the way up into Wisconsin in the prehistoric landscape. And so, yeah, one ignition may be able to support the fire regime of a whole region. And I wish we knew more about that, because it would help us understand this drivers. But your last point about, why do we think why is it important? Can we just move on to fire? I think that's, a very good question to ask. And my response would be that I think a lot of people lack a connection to fire and lack, a license to burn. They don't have a natural resources ethic to put an ignition on the ground. And maybe there's fear in there too. And I think by providing more examples, no matter what culture it is, on whatever continent, of how humans are connected to fire, just gives us more better, more support to be, ignition sources, to be prescribed burners. So I think to me, that's why it is important.
All right. Yeah, some good, great comments. It's about 12 o'clock Eastern time, so we do have to wrap things up now. I really appreciate you guys taking your time today. All four of our presenters today, it was great. And just like yesterday's stuff, I will kind of remind everyone, we do have another presentation tomorrow. So we'll be talking about prescribed fire councils tomorrow. So I encourage people to come back at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning and listen on some of that conversation. So there's still some great conversation in the chat, so people can look at that before you log off if you want to. And I would really encourage everyone also to please do the evaluation. Click on the evaluation link before you log off today. Let us know how things went, and so we can improve for the future and get some of your comments. So thanks again to all of our presenters. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. See everyone tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.